So far in the battery-damaged Contax 137MA saga, Part 1 was mostly taken up by dismantling the camera, then Part 2 and 3 were stripping and rebuilding the bottom gearbox, with Part 4 removing the shutter and rebuilding the top gearbox. I'll put links to all the previous videos down in the description. There's also a playlist should you wish to watch them all back to back. So this time round I need to concentrate on the section between the two gearboxes, in other words the shutter curtains themselves. The drums over on this side are attached to the timing gears that I removed in the last episode, while the other pair of drums contain the springs that should pull the curtains across when you fire the shutter, but the shafts that pass through them are seized solid at the moment, so some careful freeing off is required. The driven shaft for the first curtain is also seized at the moment, so I'll pop a little bit of vinegar on the end in hopes that it will be drawn into the bearing. I'm trying to avoid soaking the curtains in vinegar for the time being. If you've been following on with this series, you'll know what I'm going to say next. That took a lot longer than I expected, but finally the first curtain shaft is free from its corroded green resting place. I'll put the curtains on one side and start stripping the chassis components ready for cleaning. And into the vinegar they all go for a good old fizzing. I'll have to think about this mask plate because it has these thin plastic light seals. I haven't decided whether I'll clean the plate with those in situ or remove them first. I figured I'd remove them and clean them properly and then deal with sticking them back on later. And here they are, all decontaminated and ready for reassembly, but I think I'll start work on the curtains next. No use putting it off any longer. Before I do anything to the shutter curtains, I've lightly scribed where each curtain is glued to the drum. That way, if they come unstuck while I work on them, I've got a better chance of refitting them in the correct place. It's the alignment round the circumference of the drum that matters at this stage. Working on the seized spring drums would be a voyage of discovery. On older cameras, these were often a metal tube with threaded end caps and a big coil spring on the inside, tethered to the axle at one end and to the drum at the other end, whereas these are different. This one is the first curtain drum, and on the bottom is the guide roller for the second curtain ribbons, followed by a C-clip and a nylon washer. At the top end there was a C-clip and the guide roller, followed by another C-clip, and what looks like a press fit or maybe even welded cap, so I've no idea if I can get inside these at this point in time. I'll start by removing all the C-clips and applying some vinegar to get things moving, remembering that these springs will have 4 or 5 revolutions of preload on them, so if and when they do free up it might all get a bit frantic. OK, I've got that drum gently clamped in a vise with a bit of card to protect the shaft. I'll place a drop of vinegar on the bearing and let it soak in. My theory being that it's seized at both ends so it won't suddenly release the tension at this stage. And of course it's bubbled over onto the curtains, so I'll get that cleaned up and start again without the camera rolling. Needless to say, this is going to take a long time. I'm working on the other end now, not that the first end is free or anything, but it gives me the sense of doing something productive by turning the thing over. It's now another day, and with the ends of the spring drum a little cleaner, it's time for a closer look. On the bottom end there's a brass bush set into the non-removable end of the drum, or tube. The alkaline battery deposits have made their way into the bearing and it's stuck solid. If we now look at the top end, it's a similar situation, but there's a clearly removable section through which the spring would be inserted. As with the bottom bearing, this one is also corroded solid. If this was one of the older metal spring drums, I could attempt to press the shaft out, but I don't know how securely the bushes are set into the plastic. I might just end up pushing the bushes out of the plastic, which wouldn't necessarily be any good. Applying a large amount of heat probably isn't an option either, in case it melts the plastic. I'm assuming the end cap here is some sort of clip-in section, and if I could get the bottom end free I might be able to drift this end out, complete with the shaft, spring, end cap and brass bush. For now I'll continue attempting to soften the deposits with vinegar, but it might take forever at this rate. And then just minutes later, after applying some gentle heat, just enough to evaporate the vinegar and IPA, followed by some oil while the bearing shaft cooled, the thing started moving. It's not free enough yet, but with this amount of end float I might be able to clear the bearing successfully without removing the end cap. Although I'd like to see how the end cap works, it might be a one-way trip trying to remove it, so a more sensible solution would probably be to leave it in place. Well, maybe. When I flipped the drum over after filming that last clip, the bush was still stuck to the shaft and it had fallen out of the mount. I'm not sure what method they used to secure the bushings. I hadn't heated this end, so presumably it was just lightly bonded into the mount. So I'll drop that bush into the vinegar and take another look at that end cap. Success! I was able to simply push it out from the other end. Now I can clean everything properly and figure out whether the end cap is supposed to be bonded in place or whether it's just a friction fit. So many questions. Looking through a magnifying glass, there are signs of glue on the shoulders of the end cap and on the matching points on the inside of the drum, so I'll attempt to replicate that when I reassemble it later. Okay, that's everything cleaned up. I've soaked the spring in light oil, then removed the excess so it's just damp now. The end cap appears to be ABS or similar, and from the marks it looks like some sort of ABS solvent was used to glue it in place before. I'll set the bearing in its seat once the end cap is glued and set, but I won't film that lot because I need to concentrate as I work. Somehow I forgot to film the completed first curtain once it was reassembled, but here are both curtains reassembled. The second curtain put up a bit more of a struggle, but eventually I got inside. So the next thing is to install the curtains in the chassis section, which I'll do off camera before returning to install and hopefully set up correctly the timing gears. How hard can it be? Right, that's the curtains installed and the upper and lower chassis sections attached to the uprights. I've put a little bit of tension on the shutter curtains and now I need to attach the first curtain start cam, while the leading edge of that curtain is about 3mm from the edge of the image frame. To make that a bit easier, I'll wind the second curtain out of the way a bit and lock it in place using a pin through the screw hole. And now rotate the first curtain to the correct position, that looks like about 3mm, and insert the lock screw. Okay, I'll insert the screw off camera because I need to be in a better position to do this. According to the service manual, the two screws that pass through this shaft are pre-coated with a locking compound and are not reusable. I've just used a lightweight thread lock and I'll hope for the best. I can't remember how well I can get to this cam later on, so I'll take this opportunity to put a wipe of moly paste onto the two contact surfaces while I still can get to them. Next to go in is the shutter shaft top plate, so I'll pre-oil these bearings, also noting that the peg on the nylon return gear should sit in this hooked section when the plate is fitted. And then the first curtain stop plate can go in. This one has the remaining two screws for the plate below, the middle screw being the one that goes into the post that took so long to remove in part 4. Now it starts to get a bit more complicated. The first curtain gear and its washer need to go onto the axle, the lower pin of that gear sitting against the first curtain stop plate below. Then the shutter shaft needs to be rotated until the edge of the curtain is 3mm away from the edge of the image frame, as before. And at that point the first curtain shaft gear needs to be meshed with the first curtain gear and screwed into the shaft. That all sounds like a bit of a juggling act, so again I'll do that off camera so I can concentrate on what I'm doing. Well, that all went about how I expected, but we do now have a correctly set first curtain gear assembly. Along with the gap between the curtain and the frame edge being about 3mm, there is also supposed to be a gap of 1.5 to 2mm between the first curtain start cam and the start lever. Mine is just over 1.5mm, so that'll do. Obviously I've oiled the brass bush in the first curtain gear before I fitted it. Maybe less obviously, there's a post on the underside of this gear that strikes the first curtain stop plate, and I've given both the post and the stop plate a wipe of dry moly paste on the contact points. The same applies to this post on top of the gear too. The next bit is another juggling act. The second curtain gear and its washer can be fitted. The post on the underside of that gear needs to sit to the right of the post on the first curtain gear, otherwise things won't work. Then the second curtain shaft needs to be turned until the metal nosing on that curtain overlaps the nosing on the first curtain, and making sure the two gear posts are still in contact with each other, the second curtain shaft gear needs to be meshed with the second curtain gear and the screw inserted through the shaft. Clearly not a job to do on camera, so I'll return in one moment. And as if by magic, that bit is done. I can now move the stop latch and cock the shutter by turning the counter cam screw. Once cocked, the edge of the second curtain nosing should be 0.5mm to 1mm ahead of the first curtain nosing, and the two should be parallel. Well, the gap is about right, and they're more or less parallel. Certainly it's the same as my reference photos when I took the camera apart, so that'll probably do. I can release the shutter by flicking the start lever at the front. I'll control the speed with a screwdriver because there are no curtain brakes fitted at the moment. Next, the first curtain brake can be reinstalled. Once assembled, there's a tension spring for the brake. I've no idea what the correct tension is, so again I'll refer to my reference photos and attempt to replicate the position of the nut before lacquering it in place. It's at this point I can see in my notes that the second curtain gear came off before this braking assembly, yet the manual says to reassemble the thing in this order. I'll go away and ponder that for a while. And yes, I had to remove the second curtain gear in order to fit the first curtain brake, and then remesh the gears afterwards. The washers that go either side of the brake are some sort of plastic compound to create the friction. Well, I think that's about right, so I've lacquered the nut in place. I can now cock the shutter, which also moves the brake into position, and then fire the shutter, and the brake retards the first curtain, so hopefully it doesn't bounce. Next to go in is the second curtain stop plate. This will need adjusting a bit, so I won't do the screws too tight at the moment. The washer and left-hand threaded post in the centre of that assembly can also go in now. Well, that's infuriating. When I tightened the centre screw, both gears beneath were binding, and looking at it, they're sitting higher than the centre axle, so they will bind. All the gears and washers are exactly the same ones that came off the camera, so there's no logic for this. I guess I'll have to tear this lot apart again and see what's wrong. Okay, I took it all apart and nothing is wrong. The washers haven't got thicker, neither have the gears, and the post hasn't got shorter either. So either this screw was thread locked so it could stay in position without being fully screwed down, or maybe there were some very fine brass or copper shims to bring the post up to the correct height, and those shims were completely dissolved by the alkaline. You can see that the post was lower than the gears in this footage taken when I took the camera apart, so definitely nothing has changed. So I made the most ridiculously small shim that I've ever made, and it's not thick enough to stop the gears binding. I could make a second one, but I just don't think that's how this was originally assembled. My guess is that they applied some form of thread lock to the screw and tightened it until it was binding, then backed it off by a set amount, say 1/4 of a turn, and then let it set. So I'm going to try that route. I don't want to use any thread lock that could prevent it from being removed again, so I'm going to try some shellac, which will just need a bit of heat to free it in the future. Well, that's now done. I'll check it later to make sure it's secure. Next, the second curtain latch can go back in. This is the one operated by the electromagnet. Fitting the latch complete with its return spring is somewhat fiddly, so this is another job to do off camera. Simple once you've got room to work. The transfer switch and synchro switch can go back on. These are pretty straightforward, with 2 screws securing the transfer switch and a single screw securing the synchro switch. Lastly for now, the second curtain brake can go in. This is another one where the friction is adjustable depending on how tight you do up the nut, so I'll have to take an educated guess. All my reference photos show this with the shutter cocked, so I've pre-cocked the shutter before installing this bit. As before, I've given the contact surfaces a wipe of dry moly to reduce wear when the camera operates. And that seems to be working correctly. If I cock the shutter, both the curtain brakes are primed, and then when I fire the shutter, both brakes activate, and the transfer lever is moved, releasing the winding latch and depressing the transfer switch, ready for the auto wind to advance the shutter again. Now the second curtain latch needs to be adjusted. This might be a bit tricky to do on camera, but I'll give it a go. Firstly, cock the shutter. Then slacken the 2 screws securing the second curtain start plate. Rotate the plate so its contact point touches the second curtain start lever. Conveniently, this is now hidden behind the brake lever that I fitted earlier, so you'll probably have to imagine that part. Lock those 2 screws. Now apply 1.8 volts to the electromagnet. I'm using my bench power supply for this. And release the shutter to check that the second curtain is held by the magnet. Removing the voltage then releases the second curtain. The 2 screws now need to be lacquered in place, and also some thin superglue applied to the cutout section to creep between the movable plate and the gear so it never rattles loose. As always, that all took far longer than I expected, so following that high point of getting the shutter mechanism back up and running, I'm going to end the video now. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when the next episode is released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.